Hi, my name's Duncan Catterall. I'm a filmmaker and animator. I'm a music video director based in the UK. There's a topic I don't feel gets enough coverage, which is what are the pros and cons of shooting in a film studio? I was lucky enough to work in a film studio for a couple of years, so I've got quite a good grasp of the pluses and minuses of that situation, as well as being a freelancer and going out and working on locations or trying to hire studios with clients. I think this is quite a useful topic for anyone who is a new filmmaker, or for anyone that's thinking about hiring filmmakers and wants to know, well, why should I spend out money on a studio when I could be going to a location? And what are the pros and cons there? Why would I go and use somewhere that might potentially cost like £1.50 to hire for a day, maybe £2, it depends on the size of the studio, versus going to a location? And why would I hire a studio, put a set in it, and make it look like a location? Well, what am I doing there? Why am I doing this? In most cases, a studio will be light locked. And what I mean by light locked is all light possible has been shut out from the studio. So any light you introduce into a studio is put there by you. It's all deliberate. There are studios that use natural lighting, and this is quite an interesting kind of mid-step. There are some really, really beautiful studios that use natural light. The sun is the best light available if you can harness it in certain ways, but you are hostage to the weather. And that second factor is the other reason you may want to shoot inside, or you might want to shoot in a studio. Trying to schedule a shoot with all the crew, makeup, hair, on-screen talent, whoever else you might be using. For me as a music video director, I've got to get everyone's dates lined up. If it's a bands starting out are not likely to be able to just take the whole week off. Getting everyone's logistics lining up perfectly to go and do a shoot is hard enough without then having to think about, oh, what's the weather doing that day? There's obviously going to be better times of the year to shoot than others. If you've got longer days, shooting outside will be better. Shooting night scenes in the summer is a pain, so you want to avoid locations for that. But if you go to a studio, you've got all the light controlled for you, you're not having to think about the weather. So that is a major advantage for studios, and it's why they were created. Initially, the first studios that were ever created did actually use natural light. There weren't these big film lights that people could use really to get exposure on screen. So a lot of natural lighting was used to be able to get exposure on cellulose. If you've ever seen Georges Méliès's Voyage to the Moon, Trip to the Moon, depending on the translation, a lot of that was shot in a studio that used natural lighting. Now, that light kind of goes in and out. If you've ever seen anyone trying to do stop motion in lit conditions, the light drifts all over the place, clouds go in and out. It's a real problem. So lighting changes far faster outside than you can possibly imagine. I remember being on location, we were filming this little film with Bugatti, and we were looking down the track. I wasn't director on this, I was the visual effects guy. And there was light, you could see up this really long stretch of road that they had for it. In Germany, you could literally see the light just changing on the way up towards you. Light is so inconsistent outside. You're going to have to pick what times of day you shoot in. You're going to have to pick, the perfect weather conditions for the thing that you're making. If you've got a completely blue sky, that can be as big a problem as if you've got a completely overcast day. In many ways, at least with an overcast day, you might be able to fill in with some light or mask some stuff out. If you've got really bright sun, that can be a problem. And you definitely want to avoid the middle of the day. In a studio, that's not a problem. So there's not a lot of downsides that we're identifying here with studios other than the cost of them. If you're going to shoot in a studio, how do you manage to afford to go there? If you're a small startup company, or you're a new musician and you're just getting into things, it's pretty scary to think about the idea of hiring one of these giant film studios. Well, you don't need to. You can go and use a photographic studio. But again, there's some problems with those. Photographic studios are usually the most affordable option. A lot of them will come with like colorama backgrounds, so you can change the background that you have behind you. Some studios charge a little bit of extra if you step on any of that stuff. But if you're just getting, head and shoulder shots, or maybe a medium shot or something like that, something above the knees or something above the waist, that's absolutely fine for most use cases. When you start to put more people on screen, it starts to become more of a problem. You won't be able to get a very wide shot on a photographic backdrop. I have managed to do a few things in the past where I've filmed multiple members of the band and then stitched them back together, but it's not a very natural looking thing. It can look a bit weird. You've got to get the perspective completely right. I wouldn't recommend it. It's not my favorite thing to do, and there's nothing better than a band working off of each other to get that kind of vibe. And the same thing really if you're shooting a commercial or anything else like that. Shooting people separately and in different bits is not ideal. If you're shooting products and stuff like that, use a photographic studio. Most products are going to fit within that space, unless you're trying to give some kind of demonstration. That's some of the possibilities with photographic studios. They are the cheap option. They do work well for most things. I've just struggled as someone that works with bands, trying to just get everyone on screen at the same time. Most of the videos where I've shot in a photographic studio, you'll be able to tell because I've usually gone for much closer shots, or in any location where I've had to avoid showing something that I don't want to see on screen. Going to the larger studios, you'd be surprised what deals you can get for some quite sizable studios. There's different types of studios. One of the quite common ones you'll see are these White Cove, sometimes called Infinity Cove studios. Most of them are white, and the idea is that after a certain point you completely lose the horizon line, so it looks like it goes off into infinity. And if they're really good ones, if you stand in that studio yourself, you'll be completely lost as to where the end of this thing is. And also you probably don't want to step on that anyway, because that's going to be an expensive thing to step through. So don't go too far back in a cove studio unless you want to spend a lot of money. But they are amazing if you're trying to get something that's very clean, very simple. I think the downside with using things like a cove studio is they're not very interesting, and you have to make sure that whatever is on screen is interesting. But that's a filmmaker's problem, and that's a performer's problem. Hopefully the thing that you're putting in front of the screen there is interesting. There's other kind of variations on the theme with these kind of more blank box looks. There's a kind of grey version of the Infinity Coves and these spaces, and those can be quite good because something a bit more neutral is quite good. You don't have to have all your lighting so harsh. You can go for something a bit more low-key or whatever. And then you've got kind of black box type studios. I used to work at a studio called Pencat Studio. They built this place themselves. In fact, there were two versions of this. There was the old location and there was the new location, which was a giant one. It's no longer around, but it was an incredible studio. It's still probably the best kitted out studio I ever worked in. And that had kind of a shiny floor, so anyone that was standing there would kind of be reflected a little bit into the floor there. Downside of that studio was repainting that floor became a bit of a pain after a while. To keep it shiny, we went to a matte surface, but it was less interesting, I think, at that point. But lots of studios will repaint their floors every night and things like that. But it's one of many reasons why studios are expensive. One of the other things with studios is they'll often have a lighting grid. The one I used to work in was so well set up, we could slide the lighting grid backwards and forwards or lower it, depending on what we wanted to do. We had pantographs, which are these kind of, if you've ever seen the things that you squeeze that has like a punch thing that comes out in like a cartoon, pantographs kind of look like that, but with a light on the end. Any of that kind of kit is quite useful for shooting that space. Studio spaces need to be adaptable by having a lighting grid. Lights stay above, so if you're doing a camera move, your lights aren't getting in the way, and you can drop a light down just to where you need it as a key rather than having to move a stand around. And often you're having to work around stands and put stands in weird places just to be able to get your shot. But if you're rigging up lighting and they don't have a fancy grid that lowers up and down like we had, and even if you do, you may need to have a gaffer on set. So that's an additional expense. And this is one of the reasons why studios end up costing as much as they do. So you have a gaffer on set, maybe a Sparks, whatever, to then plug in all of the electrical gear, rig lights up. You start adding members of crew to your shoots that perhaps if you're just working with lighting stands and you've got a filmmaker that can just move those around themselves without needing a gaffer, that's going to be kind of on your economy end of things. But studios do start ramping up the kind of costs you need, because you will probably need a gaffer in most studios of any kind of size. You'll probably also be told to have a gaffer in studios of any particular size. Sometimes this can be a union thing in studios in London and stuff like that. I don't know what it's like in the States. Tell me in the comments. But you need gaffers. Gaffers are great. But you do need the budget for them. If you're working on a big production, you'll probably have a gaffer on location as well. So it may make no odds to you being in a studio. Some of the studios will have their preferred gaffer. So if you've got a crew you're used to going in with, you may need to have that conversation. The other type of studio that you can obviously get is a green screen studio. There's blue screen. Difference between blue screen and green screen is just that sometimes you may have certain elements that work better on a blue screen or a green screen. A lot of camera sensors and other things work better with green. It luminesces more and therefore it's easier to light, it's easier to key out. Thing with green screen is it's done really badly by a lot of people, and unless it's lit really well, green screen actually causes you a huge amount of extra work in post. I would avoid green screen like a plague, especially if it's one of your first videos. If you want to play with green screen, go around and find some shots on the internet that are green and well lit, play with that, get your post down, and then think about shooting somewhere. Green screens need to be lit very evenly. You also need to do whatever you can to avoid greens bouncing back at the subject. You'll see in large films that they'll often have a green screen, but the floor will still be whatever it needs to be for that scene, because where people make contact on the floor is often a bit of a pain you're having someone mask around stuff. What you don't see on Hollywood films is you think it's just one dropper and the green screen disappears, but it's never as simple as that. There's always some poor person's having to trace around something, and at that point it's like, well, was it worth it having a green screen there? And if all you're going to do is change the color of the background, just stick in a white background or a color armor background drop or something like that in a photographic studio and just use that, because green screens are a pain in the arse for post. I'd say of the videos that I've done, the ones that have taken the longest in post that are just short projects have always been green screen based productions, because you've got to then build up all the elements. That does bring us along to another thing, which is kind of like a downside of studios if you don't use them right. Studios are a blank space. What are you going to put into that space to make it more interesting? Obviously, if the people you've got on screen are compelling enough, great, but it is good to have a few other visual ideas going on. Why not bring some props into that environment? Why not bring some scenery into that environment? People use sets in studios because they've got full control over their lighting. I used to film various commercials in the studio on a kind of kitchen stroke living room set that we'd had built, and that was great because you knew that was just there. You knew that it would be set up perfectly as you needed it. You knew the lighting would be consistent. And if you went to a location to try and do that, you'd just not be able to do it. I've mentioned elsewhere before that locations often need to have twice the amount of space than you realize to get the shots in. And if you're trying to get like a jib shot in someone's home with like a large jib crane pointing down as someone walks through a scene, that's going to be really hard to achieve on location. You may have very little swing room in a location, whereas If you're in a studio, you might have a good couple of meters above you, if not more. So these are all options in the studio, and these are reasons why you're likely to shoot in a studio with a set for certain kinds of productions. You can do all sorts of crazy things with film sets as well. I did one shoot where we decided to build a set on wheels so we could shake it around and simulate an earthquake. That was a fun pitch to my boss that day, but we got that one. So there's options with studios. Whatever you put in there is deliberate. So studios, try and avoid using them as a blank space. They do have their downsides in terms of cost, and if you're hiring a cheap one, think about the limitations of that space. You may not be able to get the big shots of your band or of your team or of the product that you wanted to. You're certainly not going to film a car in a photographic studio. You could get one driven into a studio and do it that way. There's some amazing studios out there. I was lucky enough to be on set with some automotive people I work with occasionally, and they were filming stuff using an overhead LED system because they could change the lighting on the fly and have all these different crazy colors overhead, as well as having like LED walls around it. There's so many things you can do if you're in a studio, but everything you do in a studio is intentional. So if you want to make the most out of a studio, think creatively. It's a blank sheet. Don't just present a blank sheet of paper back to your client or to your viewer or whoever it is you're working with. Try and be creative and come up with some more interesting ways of using a studio space, because they are so adaptable, but you've got to use them the right way. I hope this video has been interesting. If you found this useful, please press like, subscribe to this account. My name's Duncan Catterall. I'm a filmmaker and an animator based in the UK. I shoot a lot of music videos. I've worked on commercials. If you think you could use my services, get in touch. I also work in visual effects. I also advise on technical things for films and animations and corporates and stuff. So get in touch if you need me. But I'd be very happy to communicate with anyone. If you're struggling with anything, just leave me a comment. I'd happy to advise. These are my opinions, these are my experiences, but they come backed up with quite a few years of experiences of being in these places and really inhabiting studio spaces. So I hope your shoot goes well, and I look forward to catching you on the next video.